You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise and Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and I'm traveling this weekend. So in preparation for that, I thought I would bring you another wrongful conviction case from Baltimore. And if I asked the avid true crime follower to tell me about a wrongful conviction case from Baltimore, you would immediately jump to Adnan Syed and the Heyman Lee murder. But before Adnan, before the birth of true crime podcasts with the beginning of Serial, there was the murder of DeWitt Duckett. Now, this was November of 1983, and DeWitt Duckett and two other 14-year-old boys were just trying to make it to lunchtime at Harlem Park Junior High School. And I bet you can remember those times where you're staring at the clock, watching it tick down to the ringing of the bell that's going to signal it's time to head to the cafeteria. Well, as DeWitt and Ron Bishop, again, both 14 years old, slammed their science books shut and jumped up from their desks, they planned an alternate route to the cafeteria. This was so that they could avoid the crowded corridors of the aging school. So DeWitt, Ron, and another boy slipped down a deserted corridor, and they began reminiscing about a stunt they had pulled back in the first grade. But what happened next slammed them violently back into the here and now. The soon-to-be life-altering moment of three ninth graders, an older teen in a gray hoodie, had lunged from the rows of metal lockers and was now holding a gun to DeWitt's neck. The assailant demanded that DeWitt surrender his jacket. See, DeWitt was wearing a navy blue satin starter jacket with Georgetown emblazoned across the front. Okay, this is really obvious if you lived back in 1983, because at that time, the men's basketball team at Georgetown, they were dominating the NCAA. Young men throughout Maryland were saving up to purchase the jackets, and usually the cost of the jacket was around $65. Okay, let me put that in perspective for you. My first hourly paying job was in 1988, and I made $4.25 an hour. $65 was a chunk of change for a 14-year-old boy, and DeWitt had saved up his own money to purchase that jacket. DeWitt wasn't going to risk his life for that starter jacket, though, and he began removing the jacket as Ron and the other teen boy, well, they turned down the hallway and they ran. As they sped down the empty corridor, all they could hear was the thudding of their footsteps and the echoing of one solo gunshot. Ron ran into the cafeteria yelling that someone was shooting at DeWitt, and then DeWitt himself stumbled into the crowded room. The jacket was gone, and DeWitt was holding his hand against his throat. DeWitt collapsed into the arms of the principal, who had sprinted towards the commotion. Now an ambulance was called, and DeWitt was whisked away. He died later that afternoon at the R. Adams Cowley Shock Trauma Center. And that jacket, the need for that Georgetown jacket, would change the next 4 decades for three boys who weren't even in that deserted hallway. Now, I think we all view Baltimore as a high crime city. The metropolitan area often trades places with Chicago and St. Louis and Detroit for the murder capital of the nation. But in 1983, DeWitt's murder shocked the city. His death marked the first time that a student had been fatally shot in one of the city's public schools. Harlem Park Junior High was the sort of place where everyone knows everyone. The densely populated school boundaries were filled with generational families, nearly all black, and the kind of neighborhoods where the families watch out for one another. Your mother could scold your friend and vice versa. So the fact that these boys had known each other since they were toddlers was expected and not unusual. On that day, Ron just went home. He left the school, not knowing if his friend was okay. But in his 14-year-old brain, he figured he probably was. He was alive and walking, although it was more like stumbling. But in his mind, that meant that the hospital would probably fix DeWitt right up. They would make it all better and they would get back to science class soon enough. But instead, Ron became the primary witness to DeWitt's death, and the questioning happened quickly. Baltimore Police Department assigned Detective Donald Kincaid to the case, and within hours, he was questioning 16-year-olds, Alfred Chestnut, Andrew Stewart, and Ransom Watkins. Harlem Park school staff had said those 3 boys, who weren't students at the school, were seen on campus that day. Detective Kincaid made visits to Alfred's and Ransom's homes the next morning. Detective Kincaid reported that when he dropped in on Alfred, he was wearing a starter navy blue satin Georgetown jacket. Alfred told Kincaid that the jacket was his. And during each interview, the boys individually maintained their innocence. Well, pictures were taken of the teens, and Kincaid's next stop was Ron's house. Now, during that initial interview, Ron was told his friend DeWitt did not survive the assault in the deserted hallway. You guys imagine, you're 14 years old and you're finding out from a cop that your friend died with you in the hallway that day. Now, Kincaid then displayed 11 pictures of potential suspects to Ron. Those pictures included photos of Alfred, Ransom, and Andrew. Now, Ron knew those 3 boys. They were a couple of years older than him, but they had attended elementary school together, and of course they had seen each other around the neighborhood. But Ron was sure that none of the 11 pictures were of the older boy that they had encountered in the hallway that previous day. Kincaid wasn't going to let go of his theory that easily, though. He returned to Ron's home 4 days later, and on that afternoon, he questioned Ron again. Ron had nothing new to say. He didn't believe that any of the 11 Polaroids were of DeWitt's killer. Tenacious is a good word to describe Kincaid, because he shows up again that day to Ron's home. So this is the 3rd visit in 4 days, and this one happened at midnight. Obviously, Ron was asleep in bed, but respecting authority, his mother woke him, and Kincaid showed him the photo lineup again, and nothing changed. And after several minutes, Kincaid left, and Ron went back to sleep. Okay, I think it's important to note this is 1983. These boys had been raised to trust those in authority. They were questioned and pressed without parents present at times. And Ransom, okay, remember he's one of the 3 16-year-olds. Well, Ransom even said he thought if he answered all their questions that he was doing the right thing. Well, the next morning, after that midnight visit, Ron attended DeWitt's funeral at the St. Peter Claver Catholic Church. The casket was closed due to DeWitt's injuries, and the Afro-American newspaper described the service as solemn and stoic. A teacher from Harlem Park drove Ron to the cemetery for the burial. I can't even imagine what a lonely time this was for a 14-year-old. Now, just hours after the funeral, Kincaid was tipped off by school security that there might be another witness to the murder, somebody besides Ron. This one was a 13-year-old girl who was also in the 9th grade, and she was waiting for Kincaid in the conference room adjacent to the principal's office at Harlem Park. This young girl was shown the same photo array, the same 11 Polaroids, except she, under Kincaid's watchful eye, pointed to Ransom, Andrew, and Alfred. Well, that night, the night of the funeral, and just 5 days after DeWitt's murder, Kincaid picked up Ron at his home without notifying his parents. He transported the 14-year-old Ron to the homicide unit at the Baltimore PD headquarters. 2 other boys were brought in that night as well. One of them was the friend who was walking in the hallway with DeWitt and Ron on that fateful day, and none of the boys had parents with them. They're all young teens. There are no parents present. It was the same dance, but a different day. Ron was placed in a small room and the photo array was displayed in front of him on the table. Ron told the New Yorker that at this point, Kincaid had been pretty friendly with him. Persistent, but friendly. But now Kincaid was angry and frustrated and even accusatory. Kincaid hovered inches from Ron's face, treating him like he was withholding information. He kept telling Ron that the detectives knew who was in the hallway on that day. Well, Ron felt that if he didn't agree with them about who they thought was in the hallway, then he wouldn't be able to leave that night. His ticket to go home was to say yes to whatever Kincaid was telling him. Now, Kincaid even went as far as threatening Ron with a charge of accessory to murder with what the detectives were telling him. All right, so it's the same 11 photos, except this time, Kincaid went photo by photo, giving commentary about each potential suspect. When he pointed at Alfred's photo, Kincaid said to Ron, "Oh, he had the gun, right?" Well, it became clear to young Ron that Kincaid was kind of feeding him the right answers, but in a veiled way. After an hours-long interview, Ron gave in. He told Kincaid that Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom were the boys that he and DeWitt had encountered in the hallway 5 days earlier. Now, the next day, or night, I should say, at 1:00 a.m., Kincaid and a group of officers barged into Alfred Chestnut's bedroom that he shared with his younger brother. Alfred awoke to blinding lights and guns drawn. Police were rummaging through his closet where they pulled out a navy blue satin starter jacket. Alfred said he could hear his mother screaming that her son hadn't killed anyone and that the starter jacket was his jacket. She told the police she had bought it for him. Now, the story of the night was nearly identical for Ransom Watkins, awakened by blinding lights and guns in his face. When the police attempted to arrest Andrew Stewart at his home, he wasn't there. He just happened to be sleeping at a friend's home that night. But Kincaid is tenacious, remember? And he tracked Andrew down, arresting him and placing him in cuffs in the back of a wagon with Alfred and Ransom. Andrew said he remembered staring at Ransom and Alfred, shaking his head and asking through tears what was going on. Now, the arrest of the three satiated the appetite of the public. They wanted answers, and within a week, Kincaid had supposedly delivered answers. The three boys, because that's what they are, the three 16-year-old boys were charged with first-degree murder, and it was announced they would be tried as adults. Days later, Ron had a bizarre interaction. He was walking outside of Harlem Park Middle School when an 18-year-old young man named Michael Willis shouted to him. As Ron turned to see what he had to say, Michael, with a sly grin, said, "Hey, if anyone tries to take your jacket, let me know. I'll take care of them for you." Okay, this was weird. Ron barely knew Michael. He was 4 years older, and they wouldn't have hung out together in the neighborhood. As the days went past, the interaction between Michael and Ron began to just kind of itch at Ron. He kept thinking, could Michael be the kid in the gray hoodie who shot DeWitt? Okay, remember, Ron has told Kincaid that it was Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom, but that's not what he really knows, not what he's thinking deep in his soul. I believe he's trying to work out another solution, another answer to what the police have gotten wrong. Ron had told Kincaid that the gray hoodie guy had dark skin and a slight mustache. Michael Willis had those characteristics. Something else Michael Willis had. He had a Georgetown starter jacket. Well, the trial of the Harlem Park Three, it went ahead and moved forward. And Jonathan Shoup of the state attorney's office gathered his witnesses, Ron and the two other boys and the 13-year-old girl. He sat them down, and according to Ron, they rehearsed what they should say on the witness stand. Ron said he felt so outnumbered. He didn't think there were three boys in the hallway that day. He didn't think Alfred had been holding the gun before he turned to run. And he was sure that one of the boys and the girl didn't even see that encounter that happened on that day. Ron looked at Shoup and said, "It really didn't go like what you're telling us it did." Well, he said Shoup brushed him off and told him to sit down. On the third day of the trial, the 4 teens took the stand, Ron and the 3 others. The girl went first, telling the jury that she had seen the confrontation while peering through a gate. She said Alfred did the shooting and that the other 2 boys were asking for the jacket. Now, those other 2 boys who are claiming they're witnesses, they testified to almost exactly the same details. Ron sat in the hallway, agonizing over his soon-to-be moment on the stand. He told the Criminal podcast that he thought he might have a heart attack from the anxiety. And then something bizarre happened. Michael Willis, the starter jacket-wearing 18-year-old, he was outside the courtroom doors. He had been in the gallery watching the trial. And Ron found out later that his name had been brought up at the trial. A security guard had testified that he had seen Michael on school grounds that very day. Seeing Michael scared Ron even more. And when his turn came to speak, he dutifully recited the version of events that Kincaid had fed to him. After a week and a half of testimony, the jurors deliberated for 3 hours. They then returned with a guilty verdict for all 3 boys. Now, the black judge, Robert M. Bell, called the verdict a tragedy and then sentenced the boys to life in prison. He claimed he had very little choice and that he felt like he was participating in a waste of society. Now, Ron said he visited the corridor of Harlem Park Elementary just one other time after DeWitt's death. He said when he did, he kissed the wall and the floor and said a little prayer for DeWitt. And Ron's life was wrecked. He withdrew from friends. He failed in school, and he even stopped talking to family members. Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom were transferred separately to the Maryland Penitentiary. They are now 17-year-old boys who are flung into a violent adult prison. On Alfred's first day in prison, he witnessed one man stab another. And then the years just ticked on. Alfred was attacked in prison more than once. And in one incident, he was slammed across the face with the handle of a push broom, breaking his nose and jaw. Well, on the outside, Ron, alone in his thoughts, became more and more bothered that DeWitt's killer was walking free while 3 men were serving life sentences. Engulfing himself in sports, and in sports that he had great success in, like football, track, and wrestling teams, well, Ron barely graduated from high school and college. Once he walked away with that 4-year diploma, he became a counselor at a hospital in downtown Baltimore. He was plagued with nightmares, and he often had what he calls breakdowns. So many ancillary victims in this story. You've got Ron, you've got DeWitt's family, you have Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom, and the other 2 witnesses. But what about Michael Willis? Well, Michael had spent years after the convictions of the Harlem Park 3 growing his extensive rap sheet. He went to prison for his role in a shootout that injured a grandmother and a baby. And then the streets took Michael's life when he was shot in 2002. Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom, well, they made a pact. They made a promise to each other. They were in it together until the end. This meant that each time one of the 3 went before the parole board, they didn't show any remorse. They knew they hadn't done anything wrong. But that's kind of a catch-22 because remorse is how you get sprung from prison. Well, 2.5 decades passed, and the Harlem Park 3 had no hope for life outside of prison. That was until 2018. That's when Alfred used the Public Information Act to file a request for the investigation reports from the Harlem Park 3 case. Now, one of those reports, written by Detective Kincaid, listed various leads that the police had received in those initial days following DeWitt's murder. Alfred was alarmed when he saw Michael Willis's name on that list. It seems a young woman had told the police she had heard that Michael had been at the Harlem Park Middle School on the day of the shooting. She said that Michael had a gun, and that when the police arrived that day, Michael threw the gun down and ran away with some other boys. Now, the same girl said her brother had seen Michael at the Shake and Bake skating rink later that night. And while he was there, he was wearing a, you guessed it, navy blue satin Georgetown jacket. Now, Alfred was even more fired up. He sent letter after letter to the state's Conviction Integrity Unit. But when he finally sent copies of the investigation reports, that's when the unit took notice. And in 2019, they began a formal review of the investigation and the convictions. That same year, in 2019, the Conviction Integrity Unit reached out to Ron Bishop, who was now 50 years old. And even as a 50-year-old, that same scared boy emerged. He didn't answer the letter at first, fearing that he would be prosecuted for lying back in 1984. But after several days, he responded knowing it was time to tell the truth. He told the unit that there was only one shooter that day, and that he believed that person to be Michael Willis. This led the unit to reach out to the other 3 students who had testified against Alfred, Andrew, and Ransom. And once they spoke with the unit investigators, they too said their stories had been coerced by detectives, especially Detective Kincaid. Now, the female student admitted she hadn't even seen the shooting, and that, combined with hours and hours of legal work, well, that led to the release of the Harlem Park 3. On November 22nd, 2019, Marilyn Mosby, that's Maryland's state attorney, well, they visited all 3 men in prison, delivering the good news. They were to be set free. 3 days later, the 3 men were taken to the Baltimore courthouse, where the judge apologized to the men. He then set them free. In one of the most disturbing details, it was discovered that back in 1984, Ransom Watkins had told his lawyer that on one occasion when Ransom was meeting with Detective Kincaid, Ransom said Kincaid looked at him and flatly stated, "You have 2 things against you. You're black and I have a badge." Well, the unit investigation team found that the boys were mostly interrogated without parents or legal counsel. The report also stated that during one interview, one mother stormed into the police department and could be heard yelling, "Let my boy out." Well, the detectives did not comply. And then we got those 3 guilty verdicts. Now, I'm sure you're asking about compensation for the 3. Well, it did happen. And some of it was voluntary, which did give me some hope. In March of 2020, the Maryland Board of Public Works voted to pay $2 million to each of the men. All right, you can go ahead and shake your head at that. That's $2 million for 36 years of your life. Men who had no idea what adult life was until they were released from prison following their wrongful convictions. And that figures out to be about $55,000 a year. And maybe you think that's enough. I don't know. And I especially don't think the taxpayers should be on the hook for deceitful police work. But it's not over. And here's where the update comes into play. The Harlem Park 3 sued the Baltimore Police Department in 2020. Included in that lawsuit were Detective Kincaid and 2 other police officers. Well, late in 2023, the Baltimore Board of Estimates approved a settlement in that lawsuit. The trio was awarded just under $15 million each. And they get to keep all of that because the police department had to pay the attorney's fees that totaled $3.3 million. Now, the city council president said the following about the statement. Here, I'll read it verbatim. "Today, our city paid a moral, ethical, and financial debt left on us by a previous generation and decades of injustice. First and foremost, our hearts are with Alfred Chestnut, Andrew Stewart, Ransom Watkins, and their families. Nothing in this world can make up for the mental and emotional trauma that has been put on these innocent men and their families. No amount of compensation can right the wrongs of 36 years of turmoil and the residual effects on these men, their families, and the community." Well, Ransom Watkins spoke out 6 months ago following the settlement. He said that while incarcerated for 36 years, he lost many things. He said his father died, his grandfather died, his sister died, and his brother died. He said he lost everything. He said the state destroyed the connections he had with his family. I find those statements so interesting. He's not complaining about time that he lost or hopes that were dashed. He's mourning his family relationships. It's so heartbreaking. Now, Ron Bishop has found some peace after 37 years of nightmares and emptiness. He lives with his second wife in East Baltimore, and he continues to work in the mental health care field. He told The New Yorker he has found great joy in working with challenging kids. As the lawsuit was moving forward, Ron emailed the 3 men after they agreed to hear from him. Here is some of what he wrote. He said, "I'm sorry for all the pain I've caused you and your families. It was torture to sit in the courtroom, look in your faces, and lie on the stand. What saddens me the most is we were all students at Harlem Park Elementary School, and that was my connection to you. Alfred, I remember you and your brother Ivan. Ransom, I remember you and your brother Chris. And Andrew, I remember you and your sisters, because you all look identical. Andrew, you even pushed me on the tire swing that used to be on the playground behind Carey Street. You even challenged me to a race and beat me on Harlem Park Elementary's track. Knowing who you guys were made it so difficult to be on the witness stand, especially knowing you were all innocent. Now, as far as restitution for the detectives' devious tactics, the Baltimore City Council is looking at ways to seize law enforcement pensions when unlawful techniques are used to coerce testimony. You guys, we need to learn. Our interview tactics need to be improved. Detectives shouldn't be allowed to interview for hours and hours and hours. And children should be off limits without the consent of their parents or their guardian. We are getting better, and that's important that we recognize the growth. But there is still so much that needs to be improved. And the improvements will honor those men and women who diligently serve us each day. I will keep you updated on this case. All right, that's your Monday episode of Rise and Crime. Thanks for joining me on Rise and Crime. I absolutely love being part of your day. And if you're loving the content, please share this show with a friend. I always love 5-star reviews and positive comments. And you could also like and follow on our social media accounts and also on our YouTube account. And then there's the other accounts at Ono Media like Into the Dark and Murder with My Husband. Join me again on Thursday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.